welcome to the Trinity Business Ethics Speaker Series event. My name is Daniel Milan. I will not be your moderator this evening. I'm simply here to welcome you, and I'll wrap up towards the end. Very happy to introduce in a moment our guest speaker and colleague Ulrich Leicht-Dubald, who will be the moderator of the Q&A. While we wait for a few more people to join, if I could please ask you just to complete the poll. It's good for us just to get a general sense of who our audience is this evening. So if you could select either student, member of faculty, or industry practitioner to indicate which of these categories describes you the best. Once again, you're very welcome to the session, and absolutely delighted to welcome colleague and friend Mary Gentile, who is our guest speaker this evening. Mary holds a bachelor's degree from the College of William and Mary and a Ph.D. from the State University of New York, Buffalo. Formerly at Harvard Business School, she's the creator and director of the award-winning Giving Voice to Values program, launched initially with Aspen Institute and Yale School of Management, previously hosted at Babson College, and now based at the University of Virginia at the Darden School of Business. In 2017, she was named one of the top minds in ethics, compliance, risk, and leadership by Compliance Week. And in 2021, she was inducted into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame. And there are many other awards and recognitions, both for Mary and for the Giving Voice to Values program, that I will not go into now, because I think it's best for us to get the discussion going as soon as possible. In the past, I've had the opportunity to work with Mary on a few products, and it's an absolute delight to welcome you to Trinity Business School's Business Ethics Speaker Series, Mary. Also, as I mentioned, delighted to welcome my colleague Ulrich Leicht-Dubald, an associate professor in responsible leadership here at Trinity Business School. He will respond briefly to Mary's talk and then also moderate the Q&A discussion afterwards. I'd like to invite all of you to use the Q&A function at any time. So if you do have a question or a comment, please pop it into the Q&A. We will monitor that, but the order of events will then be that we'll listen to Mary first. Ulrich will take over from there. We'll have the Q&A, and I'll wrap things up just before the hour. Once again, welcome everybody, especially to you, Mary, and over to you.
Thank you, Daniel and Ulrich. I'm really delighted to be here to share Giving Voice to Values, or GVV, as I may refer to it, with you and with your colleagues and students and local practitioners at Trinity. It's a delight. So I'll probably speak for about 35 minutes or so about what Giving Voice to Values is, the research that it's based on, where it's being used, why it works, that kind of thing. And then hopefully we'll have 20 minutes or so for discussion afterward. So let me just start by saying, if you daze out at any point, I'm going to give you the bottom line right now. The main thing to remember about Giving Voice to Values is that it's about asking and answering a new question, a different question when it comes to values-driven leadership and business ethics, and ethics across our wider lives. So the typical question that we tend to try to address and answer is, what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? That's a good question. That's an important question. It's not an easy question. And it's one that, most ethics and responsible business classes already spend time on. But what GVV is about asking and trying to answer a different question, which is, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is, how can you get it done effectively? What do you need to say? To whom? In what sequence? What will the pushback be? The objections you might expect to encounter? And then what would you say? Do you do this alone? Do you do it in a group? Is it something that is a one-off situation? Or is this a systemic challenge, which therefore needs to be addressed systemically? But that's not an excuse to say nothing happens. The only time systemic change happens is through individual actions. It's just that you need to then think a little bit more long-term, more incrementally, more collaboratively. So Giving Voice to Values is about giving people the opportunity to anticipate and create the literal scripts and action plans, and then to rehearse them and practice them. So as I said, it's about asking and answering a different question, which is, how do you act effectively? Now, why do we frame it that way? I'm just going to take a step back and tell you a little bit about why we developed it that way and how it works. And I should say that although it was originally created for use in graduate business schools, that's where I spent the majority of my professional career, MBA programs, it's now being used in many, many contexts, certainly in graduate business schools, in undergraduate, executive education. It's now starting to be used across professions, engineering, law, medicine, nursing. We've worked with the military in the US, we've worked with the Australian police force, and it's also being used with many companies. I've shared it in many corporations, large and small. And I can talk about that in the Q&A if you like, about how different companies have adapted this and used it and how they're looking at the impact of it. It's also been shared literally on all 7 continents. So we can talk about that if you're curious about how it travels across culture. But taking a step back, the reason that we developed GVV the way we did, frankly, it grew out of my own crisis of faith. I've been working in this field for several decades. And back in the mid-90s, I had what I call a crisis of faith. I began to think that maybe trying to talk about and teach about values and ethics in business was at best futile and at worst hypocritical. And I began to feel that way for a number of different reasons. It seemed that I'd been, every few years there'd be a spate of scandals that would hit the press. I can go through the list for you, but I'll save time and not do that. But every time that happened, if you were working in a business school, particularly in a leading business school as I was, there would be this anxiety and angst, and we would usually create some sort of task force. And I was always on the task force. And we would interview the students and the faculty and the alumni and the recruiters. And we would try to understand what is it that we're teaching, because so many of the architects of these various scandals were graduates of these leading business schools. And typically out of that task force or committee, there'd be some new curriculum, a new course, perhaps hiring some new faculty, maybe creating a research institute, and the press releases would go out. And then a few years later, the whole cycle would start again. And I'd been involved with that cycle a number of times, and I began to just become disillusioned with that. And then the second reason for my crisis of faith was more personal. This was, again, in the late 90s. I got an invitation from a friend and colleague, Kirk Hansen, who used to lead the business ethics curriculum at Stanford Business School. And when he retired from Stanford, he went on to be the director of the Markkula Center for Professional Ethics at Santa Clara University in California. And Kirk decided around that time that he was going to host a debate. And he was going to have 2 people on one side of the debate who would be arguing that after a quarter of a century of good faith efforts to address values and ethics in business schools and business education, we had made a huge amount of progress. And then you had 2 people on the other side of the debate who were going to say we hadn't made any progress. And on the negative side of the debate, one of his invitees was Milton Friedman's son, who is also an academic. And he asked me to be on the side of the debate arguing that we'd made all this progress. So I sat down to write my remarks, and I had this sort of moment where I thought, can I lie on an ethics panel? Because I felt that I wasn't sure I could really say we'd made all this progress. So I ended up writing something sort of nuanced, that said that any of us who are educators or even managers know that there are individuals that we've had an impact on. But if I were going to try and speak more broadly, I really couldn't say that we'd made that much progress. And as I said, that was kind of a watershed moment for me, because I'd been spending a lot of my career on these issues and was feeling like, gee, is that the best I can do? But the main reason, the biggest reason for my crisis of faith was what I actually saw in the classroom or in conversations like these, where I would go into companies or go into classrooms to talk about business ethics. And typically what we would do is we'd share some sort of thorny ethical dilemma, some case study, and people would read it and they'd come into the room with an idea of what they thought the right thing to do might be. And then in the course of the debate or discussion, 2 things would happen. the first thing that would happen is people's thinking would become more complex. They would begin to realize maybe they didn't have all the information, or maybe this is kind of standard operating procedure in this industry or this company or this part of the world. Or maybe it is wrong, but if I try and do something, I'm not likely to be successful. So their thinking would become more complex. I actually think that's a good thing. You don't want people to walk into these situations naively. But the second thing that would happen was more troubling to me. I don't know if you've had this experience, but usually in a classroom or even in a corporate setting, there's usually 2-3 people that when they speak, everyone turns to listen to them. In corporate settings, they tend to be the people of the highest rank in the room. In the classroom, they were often the people who were, just the most articulate, the ones who could express a really complex idea in a clear and pithy way. Maybe they were the ones who always had a funny story to illustrate their point. But whatever it was, those people that everyone listened to tended to be the ones who were expressing the most skeptical, if not cynical, positions. They were the ones who were saying, Mary, I know what you want me to say, but in the real world, that's just not possible. So I thought, well, gee, the people who everyone listens to are the ones who are saying, forget it, you can't do this. And so I thought, gee, for all those reasons, is this really how I want to spend my life? I decided, life is short. I want to do something that matters. I'm going to take a step back from this work. I've got some other skills. And so I did. And this was in the late 90s. And around that time, I started to get consulting assignments in different situations. And one of my clients at the time was Columbia Business School. And while I was there, I was working on a project, but there were a group of senior faculty there in finance, economics, business government relations, business law, and they were all still working on this issue of ethics and business education for MBAs. And they knew about the work I had done previously at Harvard, so they asked me to take a look at what they were doing and just give them my thoughts. So this is what they were doing. This was their idea, not mine. They were asking all of the incoming MBA students. At the time, late 90s, this was about 600 students in a cohort. Upon matriculation, during orientation, they asked all of them to answer one question. And the question was, tell us about a time in your work experience so far when you were explicitly told or implicitly pressured to do something that conflicted with your own values and what you did. So they all, wrote these little, no more than a page, a couple paragraphs. They didn't have to put their names on it. They didn't have to name the organization. So it's not empirical data, it was self-reporting, but they had all these little stories and they said, would you take a look at them? We're trying to figure out what to do with them. So I read hundreds and hundreds of these, well over 1,000 over a couple of years, and they were really interesting. So let me tell you some of the things we learned. The first thing we learned is that if you think about the kinds of folks who get an MBA at Columbia, at least back then, most of them had 2-3 years of work experience already. So I could probably count on one hand the number of them who said they were never asked to do something that conflicted with their values. So they all pretty much already had a story to tell. So that was the first thing. The second thing we learned is, again, if you look at the kinds of people who get an MBA at Columbia, it's in New York City, certain industries are more heavily represented. So there were a lot of people from the financial sector, a lot of people from the big consulting firms, a lot of people from big pharma, some high tech. And so the kinds of issues they described got repetitious really quickly. They talked about inflating or deflate, being pressured to inflate or deflate billable hours in ways that didn't correspond with their work, or being pressured to tamper with or adjust the equations or the benchmarks they used to evaluate the relative attractiveness or lack of attractiveness of a particular financial transaction in order to encourage their client to take the action that would maximize revenue for the firm. Or being pressured to exaggerate the capabilities of a new product, a new piece of software, a new pharmaceutical product beyond what their data could really prove in order to maximize sales revenues. There were always pressures to engage in various forms of corruption, bribery, or facilitating payments in order to gain access to certain markets or to compete for certain RFPs. And then there were always the ubiquitous human resource issues like hiring and firing and discrimination kinds of issues. So the issues got repetitious really quickly. Often they were talking about the same companies. But what was interesting is that their responses differed, and they fell into several recognizable buckets. So the first bucket, the largest bucket, a little less than half of them said, yes, I had this conflict and it bothered me. It didn't just roll off my back, but I really didn't think I had any options. And so I just sucked it up and did what they asked me to do. And then there was a small group who said, yes, I had this conflict and it bothered me so much I couldn't bring myself to do it. But they also didn't think they had any real choice. And so they removed themselves from the situation. So some of them got themselves transferred to a different work group or manager, and a few of them even quit their jobs. But that was a small group. Now, the remainder of the whole group, so now we're talking about a third of them, said, yes, I had this conflict and I tried to do something about it. And a small group of them said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried, and by my lights, I was successful. So we thought, well, this is interesting. You know, they all, you know, got into Columbia. They've got some skills going for them. They're talking about the same kinds of issues, the same organizations. They're identifying an issue that bothers them. Why can some of them act effectively and so many do not? And so even though it wasn't real empirical data, we thought it was provocative and might be useful for teaching purposes, for pedagogy. So we brought in a researcher to kind of slice and dice and review the stories and look for patterns and themes. And in the end, you know, she couldn't say that one group was more morally troubled than the other group, because by definition, we let them define the issue. It wasn't like I gave them an issue and some of them thought it was important and others didn't. We said, talk about something that bothered you. And it wasn't that one group was more, you know, organizationally sophisticated or politically savvy than the other group, because in fact, some of the people who acted effectively were very, very clever and came up with really ingenious win-wins. But a lot of them, you know, were kind of clumsy in the way they did it and even naive. And so that wasn't really the issue. And so in the end, the only thing we could say is that the people who did this effectively at some point said something outside of their own heads. And it might have started out by talking to a friend or a spouse or a partner, but eventually it found its way into the organization and changed the trajectory of things. And so when I heard that, I was discouraged again. I went back to my crisis of faith. It's kind of a theme for me. I thought, oh, well, you know, I thought there might be something here, but I don't really see anything. But then I remembered some research that I had seen earlier, much earlier when I was still at Harvard. It was two scholars, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London, who independently decided they wanted to do research on what they were calling moral conviction. And so it was qualitative research, and they wanted to look at people who had acted in times of very high risk on their own values, their own morals, when many others had not. And they both independently decided they were going to do in-depth interviews with the population often referred to as rescuers from World War II. So these are people who had put their own lives at stake during the Holocaust. And so they found groups of these people. They did these in-depth interviews, and as qualitative research goes, you know, they found a set of themes, most of which I don't recall, but there was one that really stuck with me, probably because I was an educator. And they said that the people who had acted when so many others had not in these situations, all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult, they had had the experience with someone more senior to them. So a boss, a teacher, a mentor, even a parent, they'd had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if, and then certain kinds of moral conflicts. Now, of course, they couldn't have anticipated the Holocaust, but they did have this experience of rehearsal, practice, pre-scripting, peer coaching, and they had this experience at both the cognitive as well as the behavioral level. So at the cognitive level, they had the experience of literally naming the value or values that mattered to them and putting words to it, a kind of articulation, a script. And at the behavioral level, they had the experience of literally voicing it out loud to someone more senior to them who stood in as proxy for the kind of person they might need to communicate with in the actual circumstances. So I thought this idea of pre-scripting, rehearsal, practice, peer coaching was interesting. So I decided to do a little more exploration. So we did two kinds of exploration. The first was we gathered lots of examples. We had those examples from Columbia, but then I went out and interviewed people at all levels in organizations, from people right out of school all the way to C-suite executives, and asked them that same question from Columbia. Tell me about a time when your own values conflicted with what you felt pressured to do and how you handled it. And we got positive and negative stories. And then the other thing we did is we looked at the research. Now, this was about 15 years ago now. There was starting to be a lot of research in a number of disciplines. There's more now that suggests that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal and pre-scripting and peer coaching practice is an effective strategy. So in the field of social psychology, there's been a lot of research on habit formation. Like Charles Duhigg wrote a book to popularize this idea. And there's also the folks who study what they call positive deviance. So they look at people who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. They have a really nice phrase. It's not mine, it's theirs. They say, if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more impactful to have them act their way into a different way of thinking. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And then, there's been of late a lot of emphasis around cognitive neurosciences. And so there's work around brain plasticity, around creating new neural pathways. But the work that I'm going to talk about, because I think it makes this tangible, actually comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. So back in the day when I was still working at Harvard Business School, I decided to take a self-defense class. I don't know if it was related to working at Harvard, but I looked around Boston and there were a lot of these classes, and they all taught pretty much the same thing. They teach you the physical moves. So it's fist to bridge of nose, or heel to instep, or knee to groin, and they have you practice these moves in the air. And the idea is, now if anyone ever attacks me, I know what to do, right? But this class was different. It was a developmental model. So they would still teach you all those moves and you'd practice them in the air. But once you knew them, they'd bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, sort of like the Michelin Man, and they would line us all up and we would take turns getting attacked full force by this guy. And you could use these moves on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous because you just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked. But as the class went on, week after week, I might be talking to you over here. He would come and grab me. I would never know when. I would never know what hold he was going to use. It was utterly nerve-wracking. But the idea was that you were going to respond in the moment. And they explained to us that this is based on research called specific state muscle memory. Those of you who are athletes in the audience will be familiar with this. And the idea is that if you rehearse something in the same physiological and emotional and cognitive state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in that moment, your body will remember. So, the tennis pro practices her serve over and over before she goes to tournament. So when she's there under all that pressure, her body just naturally assumes the proper form. And so one day I'm in this class, right? And I'm lying on my back on the floor because I've failed to protect myself. And I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a default behavior, a default to voice, but not just to speaking up, but actually a default to informed voice? Because what I was learning from all these stories I was gathering is that the people who do this effectively, it's not so much whistleblowing, it's not even so much formal reporting, although that has a place, all of those things have a place, but it was actually people who used all of their own communications, negotiations, managerial, interpersonal skills to communicate in a way that would actually frame this less as reporting on and more as influencing the decision. And I also was learning that the kinds of objections that people faced were kind of predictable. In fact, in the GVV work, we've identified some of the most frequent, we call them reasons and rationalizations, some of the most frequent reasons and rationalizations, the pushback that people encounter, because they're powerful, but they're not bulletproof, but they're very hard to respond to in the moment. And so the idea was to anticipate, to practice, to become more to become more skillful at this, to have this kind of moral muscle memory. And so that was sort of the core idea. And so I went back and looked at what do we typically do in business education and in corporate education around values and ethics. And we typically do two things. We try to build awareness so people will recognize ethical issues, and we try to teach analysis so people can look at a situation and decide, is it over the line or not? In an academic setting, we'll teach them philosophy, and they'll, think about deontology or utilitarianism or virtue ethics. And in a corporate setting, we'll teach them the relevant rules and regulations and corporate code of conduct and laws. And then we'll look at, is this issue over the line or not? And those are important things, right? They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. In fact, if they're done poorly, those can become a kind of schooling for sophistry, because students can kind of learn to rationalize anything. And so what we're really, and I have some stories to tell about that if you're interested, but what we wanted to do was to also teach the third A, in addition to awareness and analysis, to teach action and to be able to build this moral muscle memory, this habit. And so we thought we needed a different kind of teaching technology, a different kind of pedagogical approach. When I'd been at Harvard Business School, I used to run their case writing program. So I was very familiar with that. I, wrote lots of cases. I hired their 60 plus case writers and trained them all. And you know what those are like. They're like 15 pages long, and they usually feature the CEO. And at the end of the case, usually he will lean back in his chair and look out the window and say, what should I do? Now, that's a really good way to teach awareness and analysis, but it doesn't necessarily teach action. In fact, I remember, usually at 5 minutes before the end of the class, after we've discussed what to do, the students would say, and then create an action plan, as if that was it. So our cases are a little different. We call them giving voice to values thought experiments. And they were based on some more research that I found very helpful. A lot of the work around behavioral ethics, behavioral psychology, and some of the social psychology research of recent years have suggested to us that typically when we encounter values conflicts, we don't sit down and make the pro and con list. We don't sit down and say, what would Kant do? Or what would John Rawls do? In fact, what we tend to do is to react emotionally, automatically. And then we tend to kind of rationalize post hoc why it was okay, or why it was even the right thing to do, or at least the only thing we could do. And it's not because we're choosing to be evil. This is an automatic, unconscious process. We're trying to protect ourselves from the cognitive dissonance of knowing something's wrong and doing it anyway. There have been lots of really interesting pieces that people have written over the years about the experience of going into a situation and then kind of becoming assimilated to the scripts, the professional scripts, the professional rationalizations, so that you begin to see things in a different way. And so, so the way we were approaching things wasn't really addressing that. We were, in fact, through these cases, we were triggering that automatic response. And so our giving voice to values thought experiments are a different kind of case. They're very short, typically. They're often just a few pages, maybe even a few paragraphs. They feature people at every level in the organization, not just the CEOs, because as I said to you, those Columbia MBA students already were confronting these issues. So we have issues about it, all levels. But the big difference is they're what one dean called post-decision making. So they end with a protagonist who already knows what he or she believes the right thing to do is. And the question is, how could they get it done effectively? What would they need to say and do? What data do they need to gather? Do they need to reframe the challenge? Do they do this alone, or do they need to build allies? What are the objections they're going to face? How do they reframe the challenge to address those? Now, none of this is mysterious. People have talked about these things before, but we don't give people the opportunity to rehearse and practice them. We spend most of our time debating what's right. And that's important too, as I said, but we never get to the action, to building this muscle memory. So the idea is that we want to literally rewire that automatic connection, so that instead of asking what's the right thing to do, which triggers that unconscious self-protective mechanism, we ask, here's a protagonist who knows what they think is right. What if you wanted to do, or what if you wanted to help them do this, or what if you were them and you knew what they thought was right? How could you get it done? So we're giving people this chance to jump over that initial automatic response. We're literally trying to rewire that connection. We know from the research, people are more creative when you bring the pressure down, the stress down, and this brings that pressure down. It actually enables people to argue points of view that they may not have felt they could have argued otherwise, because they don't want to sound naive or foolish or silly. And so that's basically the idea behind it. We created hundreds of pieces of material. There's a book series that applies this to law and to sustainability and to medicine and to young adult development and to accounting and to corporate governance and board practice. You know, people have applied it in many different ways. And we've created hundreds of pieces of material. Most recently, I was telling Daniel, we just created a suite of 8 tech ethics cases that are framed as GVV questions. So questions around bias in AI, or around corporate security and privacy, etc. And so you can apply it in so many different ways, which is why we get approached by all these different entities to help them think about this. And then companies started to approach us, because in the past, most of their corporate training was also awareness and analysis. Let's teach you the rules, the company code of conduct, the relevant laws, and then we'll give you scenarios and you can decide, is it over the line or not? And then you're done. And the point is, often it may be over the line, but if you don't think there's any possible course of action, you're going to find ways to rationalize that maybe it's okay, you know? And so the companies I was working with also saw this as leadership development, right? Because as a leader, a lot of what you often have to do is to communicate things that aren't always easy to communicate. And that's a lot of what this is about. And so we found it to receive a kind of welcome in those settings. So anyways, we created hundreds of pieces of materials, books, and there's, you know, CDs, and there's MOOCs, and there's online modules and all this stuff. There's a Coursera course, and a lot of it we made available for free, and we invited people to start using it. And the speed with which it was adopted was actually quite stunning to me, and has been quite gratifying. I'm going to wrap up. I think you've gotten the point that the main issue here is that it's a reframe. Instead of asking what's right, we ask, how do you get the right thing done? And I always tell people it's based on the 3 giving voice to values reframes or reversals. We've flipped what it is we're talking about when we talk about ethics and values in our organizations. We've flipped or reversed who it is we think we're talking to, and we've reversed how we have the conversation. So in terms of what it is we're talking about, it used to be that, you know, people would say, if you're going to talk about business ethics, don't bother to talk about the so-called clear-cut, so-called black and white, right, wrong issues. Those are easy. Focus on the gray issues, the more a little bit right, a little bit wrong. And I used to think, yeah, that makes sense. But actually, I've changed my mind on that. If you focus on the gray issues only, not that there's not a use to looking at them sometimes, but if you focus only on that, you never get past the conversation about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. You just kind of have this ongoing conversation about this or that. And so with a GVV case, we tend to focus on issues where most of us, not everybody, but most of us would agree that's clearly over the line, it's clearly illegal or fraudulent or abusive. But just because most of us may agree to that does not mean it'll be easy to act on it in an organization. So we focus on those issues so that we can get to the action question. And so that's sort of the first flip. We try to focus on issues. And even if you don't agree, we say, just what if? What if? This is the thought experiment. What if you were this protagonist who thinks this is, you know, the way to go? How could you get it done? The second flip is who we think we're talking to. It used to be I'd go into an organization, a company, or a classroom, and people would say, you know, most of the people here are good people. We just have a few bad apples, and they're the ones this is for. But I actually think of our audience differently. This is based on some research by the late Greg Dees, a friend of mine, and his colleague Peter Crampton, who did work on ethics and negotiations. And so we think of the classroom or the company or the organization as a bell curve. And at one tail end of the bell curve, we premise are the people who would self-identify as opportunists. These are the ones who would say, I will always try to maximize my own material self-interest, regardless of values. Now, nobody falls into one of these categories all the time, but these are people who, if they were being honest, would say that's their primary motivation. And then at the other tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as idealists. And we would define idealists as people who would say, I will always try and act on my values, regardless of the impact on my self-interest. What we premise is that the majority of us fall under the bell. We call them pragmatists. I put myself there. And we define that by saying people who would say, I would like to act on my values, as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll succeed. It's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll never pay a price. It simply means I have a shot. Now, if you think of your audience that way, I don't believe I have the power to change the opportunists. I think they'll always be with us. And I'm not as worried about the idealists, except I want them to be more skillful and more competent, and perhaps a little less righteous. But we're really focusing on the pragmatists, and we're saying we want to give you the skills, we want to give you the literal scripts, and importantly, we want to give you the practice to help develop this habit, this moral muscle memory, to be who you are, and the positive examples, to be who you already want to be at your best. So we're not trying to change you, we're trying to enable you, to empower you. And our premise is that if enough of the pragmatists and the idealists become more skillful at this, more competent at this, more confident at this, it changes the water that the opportunists are swimming in. So the calculus that they do to determine what is in their self-interest has to shift, because it cannot rely on the same level of silent complicity from everybody else. So that's how we've shifted the who. And finally, we've shifted how we do all this, and I've already explained that to you. Instead of asking and focusing on what is the right thing to do, we ask the question, post-decision-making question. What if you wanted to act on your value? You knew what your values were. How could you get it done? How could you get it done effectively, and give you the chance to rehearse and practice that? So there's a lot more I could say, but I'm going to stop there because I think you get the gist, and I hope we can have some time. I think we've got about 20 minutes for some questions and discussion. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was like very, very insightful and very, very interesting. So also to provide a bit time for Q&A, I will be relatively short, but I guess like one thing I found particularly compelling is to start with people's stories. And I guess one reason why I like it is that I guess I have a certain intuition that I think a lot of this is somehow like context specific, or where it becomes interesting, or you would have like interesting conversations with people when it is context specific. And that to me seemed to be a bit of like the downside of those kind of ethical lenses that will give you like a general framework you can apply to certain situations. But I can totally see the point that it's difficult to have a discussion with managers on this very generic level, because I guess my intuition is that their decisions will be deeply personal, and that also resonates with my own experience. So when I think back of those moments where I kind of, I don't know, raised an issue or had some concern, in the end, I could go through all those different frameworks, but in the end, it would be like a deeply personal decision whether I would speak up or not. And it would not so much about that I would have difficulties in kind of articulating those different ethical frameworks. It was more like a deeply personal decision on whether I think it's worthwhile the effort to do so. That's the first thing. Then the other thing I found really compelling is the whole idea of kind of practicing and going through, at least kind of getting some imagination of how it would be to be in this situation. And at the same time, I would imagine there's also like a lot of ambiguity around this kind of emotional state that people are in when they voice their complaint or their issues, because at least that's also something I took from my own experience, is oftentimes I would feel that my own emotions are not that clear. So one part would be I would feel stressed, but there would be also a mixture of like, there would be some kind of clearly idealistic motives, but there would be also something that I would not feel seen in a certain situation. And there would be also something that I would not be completely sure whether this is just me getting more attention for something where I didn't feel heard. So also, I guess the kind of emotional side seems to be quite ambivalent, or there seems to be quite some ambiguity, and that's something I find really difficult, like in like practical situations. So I guess one question would be how you could engage with this kind of also emotional ambiguity in like dealing with your cases. So I guess that would be a question I would find very interesting. And I guess in the interest of time, I stop here rambling on and hand it over to you, like to give a response and then move on to the Q&A.
Sure. Thank you so much. Those are great questions, and we can have more conversations after this if you like, because I loved all of the points you made. So let me just make a couple responses and then we can get to some others. First of all, on the subject of stories, absolutely. I always tell people that I don't think I would have created GVV if I hadn't studied narrative, because what GVV is really about is looking at the same set of facts that someone else might look at, but crafting a different narrative about what's possible. And so I think you have to understand story and you have to understand how narrative can be framed and can come up with an entirely different conclusion depending on how you frame it. The other thing is that one of the core exercises of GVV is something called the tale of two stories, where we invite people to literally reflect on themselves and to think about a time when they confronted a values conflict, and they found a way to effectively act on their values. And then they answer a few questions about that, what enabled them, what made it harder, how they felt about it. And then to look at a time when they had a values conflict and they failed to act effectively on their values, and to answer the same questions. And we have a structured small group and large group debrief. And that's a very powerful exercise, because people begin to understand that the enablers and disablers, some of them are true for all of us. I mean, if we have a boss who kills the messenger, it's kind of disabling for all of us. But some of them are going to be more true for me because I'm an introvert, and they might be different for someone who's an extrovert, or someone who's risk averse, or someone who really is much more risk taker, and things like that. Which brings us to the issue you were talking about in terms of individual differences and emotional responses. GVV has 7 pillars. I didn't go through them all today, but the one, my favorite, is the 5th one, which we call self-knowledge and alignment, which is basically what I learned from talking to people is that, and I have stories to illustrate these different things, but the people who identified as risk takers and assertive would do this very differently than the people who identified as risk averse or very cautious. And that if you preach to the risk taker that they need to be more conservative, or to the conservative and even fearful person that they need to have moral courage and be bold, either side would say, well, that's great, but it's not who I am. But we also found that people who fit those different descriptions were able to act on their values. They just did it really differently. And so one of the things that we do with GVV is we talk about how you were talking about things being context specific. Some of that is the context, the external context. Some of it is who you are. And so we actually will include, people will have the opportunity to think about, what are my strengths? How can I play to my strengths? Because then it's going to be more likely I'll do it. I know for myself, after sort of figuring out all this stuff, I started to be able to voice my values more often than I used to, because I am an introvert. But what I found is that I'm really good at doing it by asking questions. And so I found that that was effective for me, and other people will do it in very different ways. And so we try and play to all those things. And then finally, you talked about the emotional ambiguity piece. And that was also something that, I was the kind of person, I would always see things from a lot of perspectives, and then I'd doubt myself and I'd wonder, is this really the issue to bring up or whatever? And one of the things that you do with GVV is you practice. So all of those reticences because you're allowed to do it in a safe space. But secondly, you realize it doesn't have to be, people these days in companies always talk about speak up culture, and, it's framed as blowing the whistle or going to report something or even just standing up and telling someone they're wrong. And that's not how the people I talked to who did this effectively, by and large, did it. They were much more strategic. They were much more skillful. They used problem reframing. They built relationships. They talked about what will make it easier for this person to hear this. And so I think that helps to address some of the emotional ambiguity, because a lot of that is our own projection of, do I bring this up? Is this the moment that's worth it to have this confrontation? But if you start reframing it as a moral conversation and a skillful conversation, and not even just about ethics all the time, it actually begins to make those conversations more possible. And even occasionally you might realize you were wrong, which is okay too, but it's not okay if you decide you're wrong in an anticipative way. Timothy Snyder talks about anticipatory obedience, and I think that's when the problem comes up. So anyway, so I'd love to continue that conversation.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Mary. We have a question in the Q&A, and I will just read it out. It's actually a question that I also asked myself when I read your book. And so the question is, I wondered how you go about defining values with participants and stakeholders. So I guess the question is around, like, you talk about values, but it's not quite clear what those values are exactly. And it might be like, I also saw it might be good things, it might be bad things, it could be basically anything. And so the question goes on, especially with those that would prioritize or prize non-ethical values such as innovation and entrepreneurship. So I guess the question is about like those conflicts between different like values and how you go about those in your teaching.
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, that's probably one of the two questions I get most frequently, where people will say, well, it's great to teach people to voice their values, but what if they have bad values? And I have to say, when I was developing GVV, I spent many sleepless nights thinking, should I even write this book? Because of that. But I actually have a couple ways to respond to that. First of all, personally, the way I responded to it is that it was pretty clear to me that people already knew how to voice negative values. and that what we weren't rehearsing is how to voice more positive values. And so and because our cases are post decision making, I felt a little bit more reassured about that. But the other thing is, as I said before, there's 7 pillars for GVV, and the first one is values. And it's trying to get at exactly the question that this audience member raises, is like, what are the values we're talking about? And so, if you work in this field, that there'll be some groups of people who will say, values are entirely relative. It's culturally determined, it's politically, religiously determined. Cultural relativism means that really there is no way to have this conversation. And then at the other extreme are the people who say no, the absolutists who will say no, there are a core set of values that are universal, and I know what they are, and it really doesn't matter what you think, right? So either one of those positions kind of precludes the conversation that I'm talking about. But we actually have decided that the way to have this conversation is, first of all, to look at the research. And the research suggests that, of course, there are cultural differences and historical, political, religious differences. But in fact, most of the research, both philosophy and psychology, will say there are some core values, the philosophers call them hypernorms, that tend to be universally shared. The thing is that in a different context, they're going to be defined in different ways. And also, it's a really short list, and it's really high level. And so what we always say to people is the first thing to do is to look at the values conflict you're talking about and to consider, is this something that is just a matter of personal preference or comfort, or is this actually something that rises to the level of one of these hypernorms? There are things like integrity and compassion and respect, fairness. So does it rise to that level? And, if it doesn't rise to that level, it may be something we agree to disagree on. But if it rises to that level, then the issue is, how do I talk about it in a way that's going to make appeal to the value that I'm likely to share with my audience, rather than framing it in a language that's going to be unique to me, to my culture, to my religion, to my own personal history, because I'm not going to be able to communicate then, and I'll probably sound more judgmental, and I'll probably just push them away. And so that's kind of how we thought about that. But then we took it into practice and started to go internationally, because a lot of people said to me, this is great. It's going to work in the US, maybe in Western Europe. It won't work in, and then you fill in the blank. It won't work in India. It won't work in China. It won't work in Russia. It won't work in the Middle East or Africa or South America. Now, we've been to all those places with this now and have had good experiences, but I learned some things. And one of the things that I learned is that you have to acknowledge that the context is different, which it's not the same as cultural relativism. It just means, I know that you face different pressures than I do. I remember going to India and people saying to me, it was a group of entrepreneurs and faculty of entrepreneurship, and they said, Mary, we're happy to listen to you, but you got to understand, this is India. We're entrepreneurs. We can't even get a driver's license without paying a bribe. So this really isn't relevant, but we'll listen to you. And, so the first thing you had to do was to acknowledge that, yeah, I know that's true. I've been to India many times. I understand. I've faced some of it myself. And so you acknowledge the reality of the context. You're starting from a position of respect. And then you're saying, and I also know that you have values. I don't need to come here and tell you what your values are. I know that, you find it annoying that you can't get home because the policeman stopped you and was saying you were speeding when you weren't, and you have to pay a bribe to go on. I know that's annoying, So the idea here is that I'm not trying to tell you that you don't have values. I'm actually trying to help you think about creative ways to act on your values, given the unique challenges of your context. And then once you do that, then you explain the GVV thought experiment that I already explained to you, where I talk about, I'm not going to ask you, what would you do? I'm going to say, what if you were this person who thinks this is the right thing to do? How could they be successful? Which brings the pressure down and leads to more creativity. And it enables people to actually entertain the idea that they were defending against, because if you don't believe something's possible, you don't want to believe it. If you don't believe something's possible, you don't want to think you have to do it. And so by actually making it this what if question, you're kind of freeing them from that. And then I always try and have examples from the culture that I'm in of someone who did this successfully, which triggers both a sense of pride, but also a sense of competition. And then I always have to explain that the voice in giving voice to values is a metaphor. It doesn't mean going to your boss and telling them they're evil or something like that. It means many different things. It might mean asking questions. It might mean writing a memo or doing research. It might mean making sure that someone who has different information gets into the conversation. It might mean talking to someone who talks to someone who has the ear of the decision maker. There's many different ways this happens. And so we have some cases now in various cultures, in Africa, in India, in China, where people use this, in South America, where people use this in different ways. And so that's how we kind of get around those issues around what values are we talking about. It's a pretty short list. And like I say, we tend to try and focus on those more clear-cut issues where most people would agree, that's probably over the line, because what we're trying to do is enable people. And if you get better at those, you're going to be better at being able to talk about the gray issues as well.
All right, thank you so much, Mary. I think I will just ask you two very short follow-up questions, and then we should also provide time for Daniel for the closing on time. And there's one question, whether there is values that you think are kind of particularly important for positive change in organizations, and the other is from David Horan, like a colleague of ours who works on inter-organizational dialogue, and the question is whether you also apply the concept to those kind of contexts.
To dialogue?
Now, between organizations, so I guess it's about like NGOs and organizations and having these kind of more sector level conversations. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah. So the first question about important values for organizational change, people will often ask you after you give a talk, what's the one thing you want people to walk away with? And I always kind of say, I want people to realize that they probably have more choices than they think they do. Because one of the things that we've learned from this research is that a lot of times people don't act on their values because they say it's not possible. And yet when we talk to people, we find people who've always found really creative ways to do things that someone else, even me, might say, I don't know how that's possible. And so that's sort of the one thing in an organization. The other thing is that to really frame this as leadership conversations, that we're changing the conversation. We're making it possible to raise these issues and to talk about these issues and to do it in a way where it's not a self-righteous thing. It's more of a really interactive and communications kind of thing. And so the organizations that I've worked with, it's always kind of interesting to see people who start raising things that they've been thinking about for a long time, but they didn't think it was okay to talk about. And so in terms of organizational change, I'd love to talk to whoever asked that question and share some examples from the companies we've worked with. In terms of inter-organization kind of conversations, I haven't explicitly worked with companies or with NGOs who were saying that was their task, but I have to think that this same, well, actually I did. In Cairo, I was invited to Cairo a few years ago by, it was both a university, the German University of Cairo, and the ILO, the International Labor Organization that was based in Egypt. And they brought together representatives from NGOs, from companies, and from academic institutions. And they did actually identify, and actually they built a book out of the convening where they identified a number of issues, many of which were kind of joint NGO and corporate initiatives around various things like, full employment and housing and other kinds of issues. And they framed them as GVV cases because there's always the rationalization or the argument about why certain things aren't possible. And so giving people the opportunity to practice ways to reframe the challenge and script it, and having the very people who would be voicing the negative reaction be the ones who are thinking about how would I raise this issue, actually creates a kind of learning that can be the most powerful learning, because they've been required to now put themselves in the other place. So if whoever asked that question is interested, they can reach out to me and I'd be happy to share a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Mary, for those great examples and those insights. I guess that was really rich and interesting. Given that we already a bit over time, I hand it over to Danielle for the closing.
Thank you, Ulrich.
Thanks very much, Ulrich. And before I thank our guests, just very briefly a reminder of what's still to come in this 2022-23 series. So on the 2nd of March, we will have a hybrid event at Trinity College. It's likely to be changed to a lunch hour event, but Klaus Musmeyer, who's the Chief Ethics, Risk and Compliance Officer at Novartis, is going to be talking about the way in which they crowdsourced their code of ethics. And I think that will really be an interesting session. Then on the 16th of March, to really kick us off for a St. Patrick's Day weekend, we'll have Miel Kaptein from the Rotterdam School of Management talking about stakeholder ethics or business ethics. And then we'll wrap up on the 30th of March with Professor Judith Walls from the University of St. Gallen, who will talk about sustainability strategy and governance. So please have a look on the Trinity Business School website as well for information about those speakers, and please register in advance if you're interested in attending any of those. And then finally, first of all, Ulrich, for your moderation, but most especially Mary for your excellent presentation this evening. Thank you so much. I always find it inspiring to listen to you. I've used the work that you've done with groups ranging from executives to undergraduate students, and it always makes a big impact. So once again, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks everybody for attending this evening, and from our side, goodbye. Bye-bye.